prototyping is a very big thing for me. The prototype is kind of like a primitive form. I think one of my big inspirations was this writer, Paul Scherbart, who wrote a book about trying to invent a perpetual motion machine. I actually wrote my master's thesis about this small book. As we know, there is no way to invent a perpetual motion machine, but he did not really know that at the time. This was written more than 100 years ago. He was a philosopher and writer who was also wanting to become an inventor. In his own laundry room, he hired a plumber. He was going to invent this machine that would make him lots of money and he'll be lifted out of poverty as a writer and philosopher. But of course, he did not, because it's impossible. In the process, he wrote a book about, he imagined with infinite energy, how art, culture, architecture, and the world would change. So that book, instead, his process of building prototypes became his inspiration for writing about the future and how he hoped it would turn out. So these are maybe some images of another project that I was doing that also involved a lot of photogrammetry. This is like 3D scans. Some of these are constructed using software that takes normal photographs, are able to reconstruct them as objects. Just to show a few pictures of some of other projects that I worked on that are involving this kind of prototyping, trying to use digital data that we have about spaces, about places, and turn them into prototypes that can be converted into something physical. This is just showing you some of the other works that are using data sets online of users who have actually created scans of their rooms and they've put it on the Creative Commons. So these are scans that are often problematic, like you can see all the holes here. For me, I was trying to turn these Creative Commons scans into objects that you could hold and examine. Nowadays, when we have the iPhone, it is even easier to scan it because a lot of the devices are very portable. They have a LiDAR scanner. There are lots of different technologies, even software like AGSoft's photogrammetry software that allows you to produce pretty high resolution scans. You don't have to be a pro at it, but there are lots of different ways for people and also artists to incorporate this kind of visual data into the work. Of course, as you can see here, I'm also a big fan of using it or finding ways to make a glitchy version of itself. Of course, it's still a consumer technology. It's not like the technology is perfect, but you can really create really odd things from it. What you're seeing is actually a kind of space in Singapore called the Void Deck. All the public housing blocks, they do not have houses on the first floor. The first floor is a common space that they call the Void Deck. Both my parents' house and my own house, because we both live in the government public housing, it all has this type of space, the Void Deck. I know it's about an activity space, but then actually in this space, you can't do ball games, you can't have a nap. It's a restrictive public space and probably quite unique to Singapore. I'm going to skip this one, but just thinking about the space, because when I had my daughter 3 years ago, when she was a very small baby, this is the only thing I see of the outside world when Singapore was also under lockdown. I have to work. I was teaching full time. So I would only go from my parents' void deck to my own void deck every day. I'll go and bring my baby to their house and then bring them back. I wanted to capture that atmosphere of seeing this as the only thing that you see early in the morning when you go to between these two bright spots in your journey during lockdown, for example. The work itself is a journey in which you are in this boat and you're sailing between these void decks. These void decks are like ruins in the sea. And the one that you're seeing here is a cave version. That cave is referring to a kind of immersive virtual environment. It was made using 3 projectors and with a Kinect, which has a skeletal sensor. It is a motion sensor that can detect the movement. So in the first iteration of this work, people could just use their shoulders and turn, and the boat will also turn with the body. In essence, it was a game in which you're picking up these baby's face balls in the sea, but you can traverse through the sea and sail between these ruins in the sea. It's kind of like an exploratory game. There isn't a goal to it. The goal is just to explore and maybe feel also the ambience of this journey. So this is an exhibition view in Basel in the House of Electronic Arts. The work, I later translated it into a virtual reality work so that the environment would be even more immersive than the cave setup. So maybe I play this little video. So that was the video. The last book I want to share with you starts from this photo, actually. It starts from an event of a shipwreck in 1824, when there was a ship called the Fame that had been carrying all of the things that Raffles's family was going to go back to the UK with. So Raffles was the person from the East India Company sent by the British government to colonize Singapore. This was supposed to be the ship where he had collected all these artifacts and wanted to bring it back to the UK. But this ship that was with all its flora and fauna collections and all these riches of the Southeast Asia caught on fire when it was about to sail. What's also interesting is that then this resulted in hiring of lots of artists to repaint all the paintings of flowers and animals that had been lost. There was an attempt to try to recover it. That event always fascinated me, thinking about all this understanding of Southeast Asia. There was so much artifacts that had been collected on this boat that was also all destroyed and never made it to anywhere else. And the fact that there was this attempt to recapture it, but in such a hasty manner. I also thought about how myself, when we look back in time on these colonial period archives and talk of all the commodities that would have flowed from Singapore to the world, there is a lot that I do not understand or do not relate to, or a lot of the materials that are listed we can hardly understand in a contemporary sense today. One of the really interesting data sets that was out there is this project called Trading Consequences, which is a super big data project in the humanities, collecting all of the archives in the UK and Canada, and I believe quite a few other countries. They were all these data sets of the commodities that would have flowed between all the countries of the world in the 19th century. You can actually find a list of all the objects that were traded between Singapore and the world in the 19th century. And so many of these objects in this data set have more info than the names, but they're all in the context of the shipping information or insurance data that you get about shipping. A lot of them have very evocative names like this: Ceylon Madras, Jamaica Pepper, and they're all quite fascinating. I wanted to try to make a project that will allow you to play with these commodities. This is a data set that is generated of the items that would have been traded between Singapore and the world. I tried to scrape for all the images that I could find of it. And you will find that some of the images are quite close up and some of them are of individual items. I thought it would be interesting to see what would be the most essential depiction of acacia or the most essential alpaca. What is the essence of alpaca? I thought of using style transfer to maybe designate one of the images as a content image and to multiply it with another, because some of them are close-ups and some of them are many of the object. So could I take the individual images and multiply it with an image of many of that object to produce something that would really represent that item? This is actually thinking of the process of how we do the neural style transfer. How can we use also different machine learning that is available to also someone like myself? I'm not a computer scientist, but now I think a lot of the machine learning has reached the point where even hobbyists like myself can also play around with these concepts and also with the libraries that on my own computer at home. This is what it looks like in my Jupyter notebook, which is like a code notebook. There's a script, and then it can generate the image from multiplying the tree image of the acacia with the style image of the acacia flower, results in this horrifying image. These are trying to produce a whole library of these essential textures that could represent acacia, almond, alpaca. Of course, they look quite horrifying because they are machine produced, but it was an attempt to produce a texture that could represent that commodity. The objects themselves, I wanted to make them like these coins, almost like tokens, like the commodities they are. The whole process basically is to consider how that data set of all those documents could be used to extract that list of the commodity and to use Google Images to multiply it together to get the objects. So finally, I wanted people to engage in this as an activity to sort the commodities, to classify them, to collect them and put them into the buckets, to be involved in the categorization of it. But of course, the categories they're being sorted into are meant to be almost ridiculous as well. All these are commodities, but the names themselves, the categories, there's no right or wrong way to sort it. Each time I sort it in a different way, but yet they also kind of make sense. They are sorted in the categories like absurd phobias, imaginary, resentment, regret. Just to show you the example of the play itself, you see all these ridiculous categories for the player or the audience when they come into this virtual game. they are tasked with this impossible task of collecting and sorting all the objects into these categories. Like this beaver is being sorted into one of these ridiculous titles, Water Donuts, Futuristic, what's this, Arts and Crafts, and Rock Collection. And also there is another scene in the game where you are on this boat. This is the boat called the Fame, like the 1824 boat. There is a machine on board that is the unforgetting machine where you can use it to generate all these items. But of course, in this game, the challenge is that if you've generated too much, the boat may capsize and sink and everything might just go in the water. So these are some of the exhibition view from the Esplanade earlier this year, which showed the projected works where you are collecting the different tokens from the machine. And if there are too many on the boat will catch fire, then you'll sink into the sea with all the objects. For me, it's also thinking about how we relate to things physically, because of course, this is a game that is in the virtual reality world where you get to pick up these very real tokens and examine them. The point maybe about speculative design is like plucking something from another universe. We can't really talk about the future or a counterfactual history or alternative timelines or alternative realities. It's very hard to talk about them. But when you've got an object from that world in front of you, that's the first time we can start to talk about these things, or no, we'll be forced to talk about the future together.